morning and welcome to the Leadership and Insurance Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Bond, and I'm very lucky today to be joined by Marco from Retechnica. Marco, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing very well. What about yourself?
Yeah, no, very good, thank you. And thanks for spending some time. Just to let everyone in, we're just at that precursor to sort of Christmas period. This won't come out to the new year, but I very nearly put my Santa hat on today just to fill in the Christmas spirit. But I think the world is conspiring against the Christmas spirit, so I didn't really fancy it. But for the people listening and for the people watching, perhaps you can introduce Retechnica and what it is that you guys do.
Of course. So we may be a little unusual for this podcast because we're primarily a kind of a artificial intelligence company, and we're very focused on extracting information and meaning from documents. Mm-hmm. So we built a proprietary technology that can read through text and documents and extract exactly what's relevant to our clients, and then building on top of that a number of solutions to either streamline processes that otherwise are very lengthy, or extract intelligence that can generate actionable insight.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. So you touched on it there actually, because I reached out to you initially because your involvement in the Lloyds Lab, and you were very transparent in your response and said, we're not an sort of insurance focused business, but I wanted to have a conversation with you about automation, artificial intelligence, because obviously you had exposure to that going through the Lloyds Lab. How did you get involved with the Lloyds Lab? What was the process there?
Yeah, so what happened is that we were somehow already familiar with the company organizing the lab, and so they just reached out. Mm-hmm. And the lab, for that particular cohort, the lab was actually interested in kind of solutions that related to artificial intelligence, and so they reached out to us, and we were happy to pitch. And in all honesty, there was a fair amount of companies pitching. So I was quite surprised that we were selected. What I then later found out was the fact that the topic definitely resonates with a whole lot of people. So I'm sure your audience is familiar with this, but the way it works is essentially that the lab selects a number of companies that end up pitching to members of the Lloyd's market. And what needs to happen is that a number of those members need to say, yes, I want to engage with that company. And then at the end, there's a selection of about 10 companies that participate in a program that is, I'm going to say 10 weeks. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, we were lucky to have a fairly large number of members of the Lloyd's market that were keen to engage. And it would be all kind of the companies, mostly kind of underwriters, and essentially companies that with names that are fairly familiar. I'll keep them confidential for now, but
of course,
but all names that would be familiar to your audience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I think you must be the first person that's come on that's been invited to sort of be involved and not really be cognizant of that industry, which is lovely. Have you been involved in other sort of innovation labs before?
Yes, a couple. I guess the most relevant one was one similar but not industry focused. Was with the EY, Ernst & Young, the accounting consulting firm, and the logic was a bit different because obviously they're not a market. But it was more about engaging with their own clients. Yes. So yes, we were fairly familiar with the process, and it was reasonably similar in a variety of ways. And ultimately, what we had been doing, especially in the past 2 or 3 years, was very much working with very large companies. Mm-hmm. To identify use cases that lended themselves to automation, and then working with the companies to create, or as we say, co-create solutions that make sense for them. So that's been pretty much our core business for the past 3 years. Mm-hmm. So that, in a sense, joining the lab was very much applying those skills that we developed over those 3 years for insurance companies, for market participants in particular.
And what's your background prior? You've got a background in management consulting, is that right? Or
that's right. So personally, my background is academically in a combination of applied mathematics first and then linguistics. So funny enough, working in natural language processing seemed like a happy coincidence, but actually that's what happened. It wasn't by design, but and but then yes, I worked as a management consultant at McKinsey, and then soon moved to technology, working for a fintech company back in the early 2000s, and then in Expedia. Then I worked as an independent consultant internationally for economic development, and then came back to London to start Retechnica a few years ago. And the original idea was very much to address some of the major inefficiencies that I had experienced in my previous lives, both in technology and in management consulting. And interestingly, as we started the company, the AI was still a bit of there was a big question mark around whether or not it would work. And only in the later years, it became the buzzword that it now is. And so it was quite interesting because the number of use cases was so vast, but also very unproven. So it's been quite the journey to then zoom in on a few use cases that clearly not only deliver value, but also resonate with our audience.
So the piece of work that you commonly do, which is taking text and artificial intelligence, using that and gathering the meaning from it in an automated format. Did that come first? Was that the kind of product, or were you offering more consultancy services around kind of automation and AI, and then the product came second, or?
No, it was actually product first. So it was very, very much product first, and the consulting bit came later. Essentially, what happened is that we're very much focusing on, it was in the beginning, it was very much a technology company. We built what's called an API, which is very much a technology solution to enable other systems, other technology to interact with our system, and they provide an input and we provide an output. So it's all very technical, very much product-based, etc. What we found out is that APIs, or those kind of very technical solutions, work very well for very simple product offerings, but they don't work as well when it's not that clear how exactly to interface, to interact with this technology. And so we soon found out that there was a fair amount of hand-holding that was needed for our clients. And so that we started adding layers and layers of consulting. What we then landed on, and I'm going to say in 2017 and 18, is the business model of co-creation, which is essentially the kind of the ultimate version of what I described, whereby the client has a problem that doesn't necessarily, that you don't start by saying, I have an artificial intelligence problem. You're just saying, I have a problem, which may or may not involve some form of AI, some form of natural language processing. And then we engage in a conversation where we design a full-blown solution where our product, which is a very specific product, is one of the components. But ultimately, for most of our kind of stakeholders on the client side, what they're interested in is the solution to their problem. And I'll provide examples in a moment. And so what we do is we work with the client, with all the kind of staff members, the team of the client, and potentially also with third parties, to provide them with a full-blown solution where our product is just one of the components. And this ends up being a fairly lengthy process because we need to build a proof of concept, we need to do integrations, there's various iterations potentially. But once the whole thing is kind of working, it has been approved, then they move out to a kind of ongoing business model. So we start out by providing services to do the whole integration, the product design for the client, and then move to to a kind of an ongoing recurrent revenue type of model.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been the case, as I said, for a few years. And that obviously works primarily with fairly large companies that can fundamentally, where it makes sense for them to build a solution that is so bespoke to them, as opposed to trying to buy something off the shelf. And so to give a very simple example, outside of insurance, and then I'll kind of give examples relating to insurance. One example is for a large manufacturing company. They build significant kind of systems that may have defects, and when they need to deal with those defects, that can be quite important, quite critical. That process can take hours, or in some cases days. And what that means is that there's a very highly skilled engineer that needs to look at this problem in very great detail to solve it for several hours or days, as I said. And lo and behold, what may have happened is that another colleague from another city, potentially, or even a few desks away from him or her, may have solved a very similar problem 3 weeks before or 3 months before. And they never get to talk to each other because they don't know. So what we ended up doing with the client is we processed all the documents relating to all the defects that have been dealt with, and with the solutions that have been designed by individuals. We passed all those documents, extracted the key information from those documents in such a way that then when a new defect would emerge, the engineer would be provided with all the most similar, most relevant cases that happened in the past, and with the ambition to enable this person to validate that the case was relevant, and then quite often literally copy and paste the solution to a new document. And so this led to improvements in the kind of 80% range, so going from 3 hours to 5 minutes in many cases in terms of solving problems, because so very often there's repetition in those problems. So this is an example of obviously of what we describe as document automation. And it may be clear that this solution is incredibly bespoke to this client. The type of defects, the type of solutions, the type of documents, even the process, and even the user interfaces that we had to build was completely bespoke to this client. This was kind of several weeks, I think, to build a proof of concept that took, I'm going to say, 16 weeks. And so again, this is something that where the business case needs to make sense for the client. So obviously, this is a large company.
That's interesting, because it's such it's quite an abstract structure of data that you're looking at, and it's kind of surprising how practical that application is. And I think the reason I wanted to talk to you and reached out to you was that I think sort of AI and automation gets people very hot under the collar, particularly around replacing people. That's the big fear, I think, of people, like losing jobs and replacing people. But obviously that sounds like just a much more practical use of people's time. You've got an engineer, and you're essentially saying, well, we're going to give that engineer just a sort of a playbook to go by, which is more efficient than just turning up with and working through a much longer process, a much longer checklist, because you essentially provide them ideas. What do you you must have come across that kind of fear of AI. But what do you feel about that? What's your response when people kind of raise that as an issue?
So broadly speaking, there's a bit of the debate can be summarized as the distinction between automation and augmentation, if you like. And where augmentation is exactly as you said, is enabling machines to do the grunt work, the boring stuff, the basic stuff that people really shouldn't be doing. People shouldn't. Ideally, people are not interested and even good at doing data entry. So if a machine can do it, that would be ideal. And so there are most of the processes we deal with that require augmentation. It's very, very rare that we look at a pure automation where 100% of the process happens. And normally what augmentation means is, and case in point with the one I was describing earlier, is that nobody gets fired, but the people who are in place have more time to dedicate to really critical problems. Because what happens is that the defects that have been seen many times, copy and paste the solution because that's always the same solution. You still need a human being to review that because there may be something critical, and you need, actually in that case, you need someone to wet sign the solution physically. So there's no way the machine could ever automate the whole process because it would be frankly illegal in that particular context. But it definitely saves a lot of time, and that time can be dedicated to those very strange new defects that can be incredibly relevant. And people then have the time to perhaps think about new forms of new designs, new processes that enable the company to prevent those defects in the first place. So it really is beneficial way beyond the productivity improvement that we can look at. Hypothetically, there are scenarios where one generally substitutes 100% of the human effort with machines. I think we very rarely come across those kind of use cases because we normally work with machines and humans kind of working together, as it were. Mm-hmm. So the more there's human judgment and skill that is required for any process, the less one should be worried about that. And I think that's definitely the case, especially in the type of insurance that is relevant to for instance, the Lloyds market, because so much of that is unusual, is hard to replicate. It's a lot of one-offs in many cases. So in that context, to me, it's quite clear that there's very little that can be fully automated, and there's a lot that can be done to enable people to just spend their time in more efficient, more frankly satisfying endeavors.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I touch on all the time. Is that obviously I'm in the realm of working with people looking for new jobs and new opportunities and trying to find the best talent. And one of the things that frustrates people is and forces people to move is if the structure of their job means that they're doing more mundane tasks. Claims is always a really good example for me, is that people in the claims market want to focus on the complex, difficult, unique claims that they need their skills and experience for. What they don't want to be doing is processing claims that are straightforward and could be automated. What was, sort of going on to that? Obviously, you came to the Lloyds Lab, presented the kind of essentially your skill set almost, and the business. Yeah. What was the kind of Lloyd's response? Where did they sort of suggest where they thought the biggest use case for this would be? Or
yes. So what happened is that we primarily talked to, as I said, the Lloyd's market participants, as opposed to Lloyd's in and of itself. Lloyd's has been looking at this type of problems for a long time with other kind of solution providers. So we were mostly focused on the participants. And so we had a team of, I'm going to say, about 8 different companies that were quite involved. And in the beginning of the process, we were meeting weekly. And there was very good engagement and very heated conversations about exactly what you said, where to focus the effort. And the difficulty was not to find use cases, quite the opposite. The use cases were just like a long list. Remember, probably we got to 20 possible use cases. Wow. The difficult thing was to find something that was not already overlapping with some efforts that were already existing. Because regardless of whether those efforts were going anywhere or not, still you don't want to necessarily step on something that was already somehow happening. And so one use case that felt that very much kind of made sense to a lot of people had to do with essentially managing the inflow of underwriting kind of opportunities for an underwriting company. Because essentially what happens is that a lot of the context that they get from brokers are not entirely relevant. They're not the right risk profile, they're not the right kind of sector, they're not a line of business, etc. And so, and within the company, there's a lot of data capture to be done, there's a lot of back and forth with the broker to get the right information, etc. And so that was perceived as a fairly inefficient process, and one that, again, lends itself to a fair amount of automation. And interestingly, there is a little bit of overlap with some work that has to do with kind of standardizing a lot of this type of communication, but the belief of a lot of the people in the team, if you like, in our team of mentors, was that this would take too long and it would never be quite perfect. So having a solution that streamlines that process is quite compelling. And in the first instance, the perception was that it was very much about information extraction. You have a big document, maybe an Excel spreadsheet, some PDFs with 80 pages, and an email with a lot of disparate information. You want a system that just picks up the right information, so that you don't need a person to read through the whole thing to pick up all the right data, but also it's less error prone. As you know, as I said before, people are not really necessarily very good at data entry. So that was the first, in the kind of very first kind of idea, but in reality that became a bit much bigger, because what's also possible is almost like to manage the inflow of contacts that people get and kind of coordinate it. So making sure that the right information goes to the right people, the people who are best placed to deal with those kind of requests, and also possible to kind of capture the data to really have a better sense of what's coming in. And so that can help to kind of build the right type of teams to deal with the new needs, potentially also insight in terms of the new types of requests that are coming in to potentially identify new type of products or solutions that may be relevant. Because at the moment, if something doesn't, if underwriter request doesn't meet the criteria, it just gets discarded. But if it were possible to actually save all that information, that could build a fairly interesting database that can can assist in strategy development or product development for the company. So this was very much an idea that resonated with a lot of people, and so we spent let's say 3 weeks defining this idea, and then the remaining ones kind of designing some sort of a product, or rather mocking up a product more precisely that could solve this problem. It's obviously a complex problem with a lot of detail, etc. So we got all the way to some mock-ups and some design of a flow that made sense to our audience. And that's what we presented at the end at the Lloyds Lab, at the final demo. Let's say.
Yeah, and what's happened since then? Have you sort of, because obviously insurance was new, is it something that you're sort of continuing to engage with, or are you looking to engage with?
Yes. So it was very interesting what happened after that, and also I think by and large quite in line with our experience outside of insurance. So I think what is specific to insurance is probably that it's such a heavily document-based industry on one hand, but on the other hand, if we look at the Lloyd's market, is that it's so driven by relationship. It's also unique that there's for some of the participants, there's a perception that it's very hard to automate. It's also driven by intuition and people and expertise that is so hard to transfer into a machine, that a lot of people have the perception that, well, it's impossible to automate. And obviously that's not really the debate that one should have. The question is, what are the tasks that you're doing that are inefficient? That's really a more productive way of thinking about this. And so as we did this project, it was very interesting because we started engaging with a few companies on that specific use case. But as we presented this to a broader audience, more and more companies, and including brokers, came to us with new ideas. And so it was similar to the first experience, where people kind of got quite excited and coming up with their own ideas of applications. And so we ended up probably talking to some 15 different kind of market participants. And with each of them, slowly but surely kind of progressed towards some sort of a definition of a use case that was fairly precise, and that can then be dealt with by let's say, our process. And what ended up happening is that this process was slow enough that it dragged all the way to COVID times. And so at the end, it was quite interesting to see the various reasons why nothing properly concrete has happened yet. And this has been about a year, over a year by now. In some cases, essentially, the reason why nothing concrete has happened, those reasons are not too different from the reasons why it doesn't happen in other industries. So essentially, most large companies that are not necessarily natively data-driven or natively digital, haven't figured out necessarily how to engage with external parties to solve some of these problems. And sometimes the question is, should they engage with an external party or not? Or should they look for a off-the-shelf solution or try something bespoke? And sometimes even these questions already create a block that is insurmountable. So even when they start to engage, the definition of a use case can take a long time. Taking all the stakeholders on board can take time. Finding the right people who want to offer the budget, that's not necessarily trivial. Prioritizing it all the way to put it into action. So there's a number of stars that need to align effectively. And those ones are probably not that specific to insurance necessarily. It's a challenge for most large companies. And what we find interesting is that, from my point of view, it's quite interesting to see that the companies that have somehow, by luck or by skill, managed to solve that problem once, they almost build a muscle that enables them to then do it much faster afterwards. They have the right processes in place, there are contractual agreements, the right people, the right skills in place, so that then they can do these processes much faster, and it's an enormous benefit to them. They can really speed up all of this. And so what we often find ourselves advising is that it's painful the first time because there's so much that surprisingly needs to be set up in terms of mindset, in terms of process, in terms of skills. But if people give up, then they just delay the inevitability. That sooner or later that needs to happen. That pain needs to happen. That painful process needs to, people need to go through that to then be able to become much more skilled at that. It's almost like a muscle that they need to build. And if our capability, internal capability, and if that doesn't happen, you just delay the inevitable, because sooner or later those automated processes will arrive. So one may be. It's rare for those companies to be necessarily the pioneers of that process, but you don't necessarily want to be the latest one to join that movement.
I know. I mean, I think someone described. I think it was a really interesting comment. As a guy that's a consultant for sort of insurtech businesses, Nick, and he said to me that insurance is a fast follower industry. It's not, doesn't tend to kind of lead on a lot of this stuff, but it can be quick to follow. So I definitely think you get the culture. And it's interesting for me because you see sort of people embrace change, and obviously most of my role is looking at change, because where there's change, there's needs to hire and new people, a new culture, and then once the sort of industry embraces, data science, for example, once the sort of business has started to embrace data science, you then had a cohort of data scientists that were kind of blooded in the insurance industry, so they had that, and then what happens is that they move to different businesses, and you start to kind of then get the kind of infiltration of that culture. And now, it's obviously very normal to have a data science team, and kind of, it's very different what they all do. And there's still some very loose kind of, what they bring to the insurance market is different depending on what person you speak to. But the culture of having one exists. And I think this is similar for automation. If you've got a business that embraces change, and they're the first people to do it, then what tends to happen is that those people they move around the market and they bring that culture with them. Because it seems to me that culture seems to be the biggest obstacle that you face for any type of change, whether it be bringing in automation or anything else.
No, absolutely. It's definitely not a technology or a product challenge. It's very much a cultural challenge. The thing is, we've seen this working in contexts that are, fundamentally quite similar to insurance. And so we've seen when it works, it's very much down to culture and down to, frankly, resilience and and grit to go through the obstacles that you need. The individuals that we need to believe in this enough to go through compliance, to go through legal, to go through IT, and just keep pushing, because they know that that's the only way for that to happen. And as you said, and a lot of the cultural change can happen with new skills that are coming from slightly more junior ranks, if you like. But there's also a need for the senior team to be appreciative of this, and sometimes that's harder because senior leaders come from a background that is not necessarily natively digital, and so some of them we find are very keen to adopt these new technologies, but then the expectations are not necessarily always aligned with reality. And so when you talk about automation, people kind of, again, either mistrust it or perceive it as a bit of a magic wand that removes processes altogether. And unfortunately, the reality is more nuanced, and it takes effort to get to a level of automation where you may end up automating 70%, 80% of the process, and that when you quantify it, the ROI is incredible. One needs to move from the idea of automating things, this kind of abstract concept, to the gritty reality of the effort that it takes, the weeks of effort of training systems on really understanding what kind of information is needed for what, how to change the processes, all of that. And obviously the cultural change you were referring to then deliver the ROI.
Is one of the challenges, like one of the biggest challenges, it seems to me, that is defining what success looks like for automation. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so when we pitch this kind of process, this kind of project, quite often we want to show people that you don't go from 100% manual to 100% automated. And again, the example I was mentioned before about the defect is a case in point. And what happens is that first you identify kind of low-hanging fruits of things that can easily be automated because they're very, very similar to what's been done, etc. And you capture that, and the value begins to be significant. What you really do, that's not the end. What you really do is you start to identify the processes that enable this automation and how to have a bit of a hybrid system of partly human, partly automated, if you like. And so then there's the next stage where you kind of expand the automation aspect. And some of that is pure automated. The whole process is pure automated. Some of that is augmented, where the person is gonna work on the same task, but it's gonna take 50% of the time, for instance. And so you start to have a situation where 30% is fully aligned with the old ways, as it were. 30% is, let's say, augmented, and 40% is fully automated. And then you keep progressing, and hopefully you see the chart kind of shifting towards a more and more efficient process where less and less requires a full-time effort of a person, and more can be aided by the machine. And this can take, it can take weeks in some cases, it can take months in other cases, depending very much on the circumstances. And so again, it's for someone who hopes to see the system being completely streamlined, completely automated, it can be disappointing. And but
that's reality. That's the only way to get there. And ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, those 6 months are definitely worth the effort. And again, as I was saying, once you start looking at the ROI, it can be quite incredible.
And it's not just, I think it's easy to get pulled into the conversation of when you automate, you instantly save money. And while that objectively might be the long-term view, because if you automate tasks and you're not paying people manually to do it, then by nature that will continue to get more efficient and it will save money from an ROI point of view. But as you were talking, I was just thinking, going back to that thing about people doing meaningful work, having time to do that. One, you've got potentially a happier workforce, but one would imagine there's a lot of opportunities to add quality, to add premium to the product, and whether it be insurance or manufacturing or anything else, you've got time to produce a better product or a better service, and that's a better use of your time, because even if the kind of cost base is the same, because you might still need to employ that person for exactly the same amount of hours, and actually you've potentially got an additional cost of running the automation process. But if that allows you to come out the back end with a better quality product, you can charge more for it. So the maths of it will still work, even if there's kind of not a directly attributable cost save on the automation.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. The way we sometimes summarize it is that sometimes companies come for the productivity gain, but stay for the byproducts that they didn't expect. And the thing is, when you do a project like that, it's very hard to say you're gonna have gains that are intangibles. So because people, they're investing money, it doesn't have to be a lot of money, but some sort of budget, they need to kind of think about an ROI. So it's easy to say, well, the productivity gain is there. And then obviously, as you said, you may need to redeploy people. And so, but to say that the same process instead of 3 hours takes 5 minutes, it's intuitively a clear gain. But exactly as you said, regardless of ultimately how the company manages those productivity gains, there's, as you said, there's a number of other benefits. So one of them is what you pointed to, the fact that people will no longer feel drained by performing mundane tasks that obviously should be automated, and that's very, very important. So less turnover, more satisfaction, etc. Another one is the quality time that this team can dedicate to other tasks that can be value adding and quite innovative. And then the third one is the data that you're gathering that can be incredibly valuable, and that was very much the case in the project that I was describing earlier. For instance, reduce the number of defects in that particular case, but in the case of insurance would have been to capture new opportunities that you wouldn't expect because you haven't been focusing on them. And because that's not part of your core business necessarily. So it's easier to justify this with productivity gains because that gets the door open. But in hindsight, when people succeed and they look back, probably the main benefit is not going to be that. It's going to be something else. It can be the analytics you can build on top of that. It can be the kind of new projects that have been possible because those people have been liberated from those mundane tasks. So ultimately, when you look at an organization that automates the right stuff, it just makes more sense. It just really you let the machines do what they're good at, and then people are liberated to do what they're good at, and the benefits are kind of spread throughout the organization in a very positive manner.
Yeah, that's I think that's such a good summation. Let the machines do what they're good at, and the people do what they're good at.
Exactly.
Sounds so obvious, but I think there's a risk of we can underplay, and I think when AI has become very much a buzzword of the industry, particularly insurance has been in love with it as an idea and as a term. We don't delve into that enough. I mean, it's been the same in my industry. There's a hell of a lot of work that can be automated, and I think it's easy to get defensive because you think it's devaluing what you're doing. But if you look at it through another glass, you say, well, what's the thing you're better at? And it would be the interaction with people. It would be the management of kind of like the fit. But and you can spend more time doing that. You can spend more time with your clients and your candidates, in my example, than spending time on kind of putting research documents together, which is a lot of my work. I was going to ask you, and I'm unconscious of time, but I think this is probably a good question to sort of wrap things up on. So if you're a business thinking about automating or think about sort of looking at these sorts of solutions, what are the best things you can do? I don't know, there's probably an endless amount, but what's the top 3 things you can do to get ready to look at automating some of your processes?
Yes. So ironically, I feel like to get this going, it's all about people first and foremost. So you need a team, or at least an individual, that are champions, not necessarily of automation in and of itself. Automation in and of itself is not value, but of some sort of modernization of processes. And in some companies, you need to ring fence some sort of budget. In other companies, you need to have targets that are spread through the organization, but somehow there needs to be an impetus that comes from the top that this needs to happen. And there need to be champions for that to happen. And once the right people are in place, they need to identify use cases. In some companies, the right skills to identify the right use cases are already in the company. In other companies, they're not. And so it becomes absolutely critical to find the right partners. There's a lot of snake oil being sold out there. There's a lot of
I'm glad you said
ultimately there's a lot of people who are trying to, who are trying to use the same hammer on everything, even though it's not the right nail, as it were. To just switch to different metaphor. And so it's incredibly important to find a partner that just handholds you in the right place, and ultimately they are trying to support you for a long-term relationship. And so what then, and then you start, once you've identified a use case that makes sense from a company point of view, from a commercial point of view, and also from a technology point of view, it's feasible, that where it's conceivable that you get to an end result within budget, within the right time frames, etc. Then you need the patience to engage the right people, change some processes to be able to have proof of concept that from a budget point of view can make sense. And sometimes it involves finance or legal or IT, depending on the context. And so that's the groundwork, the boring groundwork that needs to happen, but they not only need to happen once, because once you get that muscle built, the first time it's hard, the second time is a bit easier, then the third time it gets kind of easy, and then everybody can get involved in that. And so it takes a bit of patience for those times, but then the benefits become clear. And the first success really gives a lot of energy and motivation for further successes to happen. So my recommendation is to have a bit of patience and trust in the fact that these things, when they work amazingly well, and it can become a competitive advantage, especially now. Probably in 2-3 years from now, this will become more and more commoditized, and definitely 10 years from now. But it's absolutely possible to deliver benefits right now, and it doesn't have to break the bank. It doesn't have to be disruptive. It doesn't have to introduce any form of kind of issues with security, confidentiality, privacy, anything like that. It's doable. It's very practically doable. It just requires a bit of patience and a bit of enthusiasm, let's say, at all levels, be it senior level, IT, compliance, legal, obviously the people involved in the process in the first place. So so it's worth the effort. We've seen it working, and when it works, it definitely makes a difference. So it's worth the effort. I definitely would recommend it.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, look, that's a really good place to end it, and I can promise everyone out there that I didn't tell Marco that it was all about hiring the right people to or having the right people in the business to initiate automation. But if anyone does need anyone, I know a few good people. Marco, where can people contact you? Where's the best place for those insurance people out there looking to automate? Via the website, or have you got an email address? Or
yes, the email address is marco@retechnica.com, marco@retechnica.com. And they can go to the Retechnica website, or they can go to our product website. It's called Ingenia API. And so that's also a good place where to find us. And but ultimately, it's very much about having a very open-ended conversation. We're very pragmatic and quick in saying whether we're the right fit or not. And if not, we're still trying to be helpful and kind of point in the right direction. If we're the right fit, we'll try to design a solution that makes sense before getting hands dirty, so that we have a process where we try to minimize risk and costs and time for the client before getting all involved in projects. So no harm in having a first conversation and see what happens.
Absolutely. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for being a guest. Super interesting, and I think there's loads coming next year. And you know, if anything's been taught by this year, it's kind of the need for kind of more digitalisation of the insurance industry. So thank you once again. Really appreciate your time, and yeah, I'll catch up with you very soon.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, man.